Hello, friends, and welcome to the April 12th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. I want to start today with a couple of quick announcements. First, we are excited to be joined today by our Executive Director, Bee Moorhead, who will be talking about the increased activism of Texans of faith and Texas faith leaders opposing voter suppression. We invite you to sign the Texas Faith for Fair Elections statement at texasimpact.org/elections. And I know Bee will be talking about other opportunities for you to get involved. And we're going to be changing things up a little bit today from our typical schedule. Usually we would have a guest policy advocate talk about our issue of the week. But rather than having an outside guest to talk about this week's issue, our very own Josh Houston will update us on religious freedom because, frankly, he's probably the best and most equipped person in the state of Texas to lead that conversation. So we'll look forward to that. After Josh, we'll welcome Bee for our legislative update before returning to Josh to walk us through our action alert for this week, which will focus heavily on hunger, payday lending, and bullying of the LGBT community. That action alert will be available soon at texasimpact.org in the Action Center. But before all of that, I'm honored to welcome to the conversation today a leader in the Dallas faith community and, frankly, the national faith community who has a heart for religious freedom. Reverend George Mason has been the senior pastor of Wilshire Baptist Church since August 1989. He is a nationally recognized religious leader serving the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Southwest, has a leadership role in Pastors for Texas Children and Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square. Some of our Methodist friends will be excited to know that he is the lead advisor for the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology at SMU. He's also the founder and president of Faith Commons, a multi-ethnic, multi-faith organization committed to bringing faith to life by promoting the common good, and somebody that we have had a chance to get to know and work with over the course of the last few months. I've been excited to work with you all in a coalition that group has put together. So with no further ado, one more thing I just have to say, George, before turning the floor over. Probably most importantly in terms of introducing you today is that you are Josh's pastor from growing up. And so we appreciate the work you did in molding him into the leader that he is today. So with no further ado, George, thank you so much for joining us. And the floor is now yours for this week's Weekly Word.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's wonderful to be with you and the whole Texas Impact community as well. We love working with you. And it is a special privilege now to be at a time in my life when the tables are turned and I am learning from Josh instead of the other way around. So let me just say a few words quickly about this subject of advocacy with respect to religious liberty. First of all, a quick reminder that advocacy comes from the Latin, which means really to one who is called alongside another. In fact, in the New Testament, in the Bible, this is something that the Holy Spirit is called, one who is given to walk alongside of, or to come alongside, or take the side of, to defend. And of course, we call lawyers often advocates. But advocates for public policy don't have to have JDs and they don't have to be religious people, but they are people who stand alongside those who need defending, those whose rights are threatened. And so when we're talking about advocacy for religious liberty, we're talking about those who have their rights impinged upon in our society in a way that threatens the vitality of religious liberty, which is foundational in this country. And when I say it's foundational, I say that because so much of the history of our country is rooted in this commitment to the freedom of religion. Our First Amendment to the Constitution is there because the Constitution itself did not adequately provide for religious protections for individuals and groups. We lived during a period originally in colonial times in which states had established churches, and minorities suffered where their conscience was mistreated, and where their groups had to pay taxes to another religious for the support of another religious group that violated their conscience. And so when it came time to determine that we would be a country, a United States of America, the Constitution did not adequately provide for those liberties. And so the Bill of Rights, of course, was established in order to do so. A brief moment of privilege, I suppose, is to say that my namesake, George Mason of Virginia, refused to sign the Constitution, though he was at the Constitutional Convention, because he did not believe that it adequately provided for rights such as religion. He himself was the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. And when the Bill of Rights was finally adopted, James Madison took a copy of it and rode out on horseback to Gunton Hall, where George Mason lived. He was elderly at the time, and they celebrated this success at last. But let's go back to the very principle here, and that is that government should neither be supportive of nor hostile to religion. The First Amendment, of course, famously has the two clauses of the Non-Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And for much of our history, we have been working hard to maintain the tender balance between those two things. We have had in the last 3 decades, really, a shift that's been taking place that has required more and more advocacy, however, as we saw in a case in Oregon that had to do with the use of peyote in traditional Native American ceremonies, that Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, said that this was against the law and therefore should not be so accommodated. And this raised all sorts of questions because it did not seem to have a state compelling interest. And so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act came to pass in order that government should not substantially burden religious exercises without compelling justification. And then only then should they use the least restrictive way possible to deal with it. But that shift then gave way to another movement in which RFRA was expanded in the 2014 Hobby Lobby case to mean that even the conscience of the owners of a for-profit corporation could not be impinged upon, even though that led to discrimination against their own employees with regard to contraception and healthcare and that sort of thing. And this has opened the floodgates now to a new interpretation of religious liberty that is now, in my judgment, being used to give the right of anyone to discriminate if they have sincerely held beliefs. And this is now being used primarily for more conservative evangelical Christians to be able to deny health care, to deny the ability for LGBTQ persons to adopt or be foster care parents. We're seeing, the rights of people, say, for instance, Jews who believe that abortion is a right. Of course, many Christians do as well, but their conscience is overridden by those who believe that life begins at conception, which is not a Jewish tenet. And Then you have issues in the public schools about accommodation for Muslims and the wearing of hijabs, of prayer times and things of this nature. And we saw an issue, of course, in recent times when a Muslim chaplain that was requested before a death penalty was carried out was denied. The accommodation was not allowed because it seemed to create too much of a burden. Well, so these are the kinds of things that we're witnessing. We have public school issues of how things are being taught and whether there is a generosity to people of all faiths in the interpretation of our country's history. And so to summarize quickly, we have to step in because religious liberty is not guaranteed until we fight for it, until we defend it, until we see to it that the ideals of our country that are encoded in our founding documents actually become what they were intended all along in the actual lived experience of our life together. So thank you for listening and for the time together. There are opportunities that we will have to address these sorts of things at a state level. But for now, that's more or less a general introduction and I hope an inspiration and motivation that this is important work that we do.
Well, George, thank you so much for that message and for the time today, and then more for the years of leadership you have provided on this issue. I don't normally ask Josh to critique our weekly work, but Josh, since this is the former teacher, how did he do? Is that all right?
Oh, come and get me, Josh.
I had a bunch of things I was going to say, and I'm crossing them all off. But thank you for doing my job for me. So.
Yeah. Great.
Well, again, thank you for the time today, and thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Okay, good to see you all. Take care.
Josh, we're going to turn it over to you now. You're not usually in this slot, so hopefully we can make it through. Let's start out. Help us understand. You've done a ton of work on this. Texas Impact has a publication called Equal Liberty that you might or might not reference. But just walk us through at the beginning what Texas Impact's understanding of religious freedom is.
Okay, so let's get real fundamental and talk about what is freedom, what is liberty, because we hear that word a lot, and it is a contested concept. It is a term that we're not willing to relinquish. Liberty, and I'm quoting from a Harvard law professor from 100 years ago, liberty is the right to swing your arms wildly and look as ridiculous as you want to look, so long as you don't hit somebody else in the nose in doing so. Your right to swing your arms wildly ends where somebody else's nose begins. That is a real simple way to think about it. It applies to all liberty. Liberty is a thing that we all share equally. It is an equal liberty. This was the liberty intended by the founders. That's the social contract theory of equal liberty that we've lived under since 1776. Any other configuration where somebody is allowed to be punched in the nose through the force of law is might makes right. And that's not liberty. That's a form of tyranny. So this applies to all kinds of liberty, economic or civil, but especially in this case, we're talking about religious liberty, it applies to religion as well. So the way that we go about looking at any bill, really any issue, but in this case, we're talking about legislation that touches or affects religion, is we apply three principles. The very first principle is that government must not prefer or disadvantage one faith relative to another faith. And that includes, and this is super important, that includes those of no faith at all. Because if you don't have the right to not be religious, then you really don't have religious freedom. The second principle is that government must not force any person to act against their conscience unless there is a state interest that compels it. And then the limit is number three. Government must not permit adherents of one faith to harm non-adherents of that faith as an expression of that faith. So that's the limit. You shouldn't have your conscience curbed unless that conscience is affecting somebody else's equal right and equal liberty to exist and be and not be harmed by the expression of your faith. So these are the three principles we apply to any bill that touches or affects religion. Any other configuration of those principles is not liberty, it's not freedom. And we didn't just pull these out of thin air. These are rooted in the jurisprudence, over 200 years of American legal jurisprudence of the religion clauses. Of course, there's two clauses in the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects five things: speech, religion, assembly, petition, and press. Religion gets two clauses, though. All the other ones have one. We get two. It's the free exercise clause and the establishment clause, and both are super and equally important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Madison and Jefferson wrote these. It's their design. They are the twin buttresses that prevent the imposition of someone else's religion on you in a democratic society. So back in the 1776, if we're going to have a democracy, there was the possibility that one religion became the dominant religion in America and then imposed it on every minority that existed. But in 1776, it was too diverse. All the colonies were too diverse religiously. There was no majority, but there was a fear that one day there might be. So therefore, we had to create a balance to protect the rights of all. And we did. We did it well. We now live in a time where you have the imposition of religion masquerading as religious freedom. So when others will say, and let's be real honest, as white evangelical Protestants predominantly, when you look at public opinion polling, this is where it's coming from. Don't take my word for it. Check out the research from the Public Religion Research Institute. It is the white evangelical Protestant community that is using the banner of religious liberty to try to create a legislative agenda that imposes their religion and their cultural values on you. And so if that's now going on, and you'll see it because, and listen real carefully, what they're talking about is free exercise. They want free exercise to do whatever they want. But then they'll say the separation of church and state doesn't exist. It's not an either or, it's a false dichotomy. You'll hear some of this on the left in much smaller numbers, but you'll hear some of it in reverse, where it's separation of church and state, but no free exercise. It's both and. This is the free exercise clause. This is the establishment clause. It's both and they're both equally important to maintain religious liberty for everybody, to make sure that government stays neutral in matters of religion.
So we're going to pivot and spend most of the rest of this podcast talking about the Texas legislature. First of all, thanks for that overview. But before we get into the next question and the next speakers and the rest of the time, can you help us remember where we are in terms of the legislative session? My understanding is we're about 2/3 of the way through, based on my quick math this morning. So what does that mean about where we are?
Yeah, we're in that awful time period where every bill is still alive and no bill is yet dead. So the next 2-3 weeks are really going to be the critical time period for any bill originating in one chamber getting through committee. And then after that, we start to kind of get to the point where, okay, we don't have to worry about those bills anymore. So that's kind of where we're at. Let's talk about kind of what we've covered so far. It has not been a huge session for, all right, we talked about this a little bit. There are LGBTQ equality, and then there's religious liberty, and it's a Venn diagram. They're not at odds. There's an overlap in a Venn diagram on them. So there are some things that only affect LGBTQ persons. There are some things that only affect religion, and then there's the middle ground where it affects both of us. So far, the white evangelical Protestants, which are 16% of the state, but disproportionately powerful in Republican primary, so far they have chosen to really prioritize abortion. They are looking at the Supreme Court, thinking that it's time to challenge Roe versus Wade. Of course, that's not a thing that Texas Impact has a position on. I say it simply to say that's where they're spending a lot of their time legislatively. But we're also seeing it with, they're starting to pick on, let's just be real, they're bullying trans kids. I don't know how else to say it when you look at some of these bills. There's one bill that would criminalize any medical procedure that would apply to transitioning children and would make the parents criminals and would take the child away from the parents. It would terminate, well, it would be a reason for the CPS to come in and remove your kids from you if you provided medical care to your children and affirmed their gender identity. That bill is just super extreme, and you're seeing that sort of thing where they're picking on trans kids directly, as opposed to big, broad bills that are trying to say, we're about religious liberty. And they're written so broadly that they affect any number of things that wouldn't be liberty at all. We're seeing them return on voting rights. So the religious right return and engaging on, and I don't mean in a good way. I mean, they're supporting something like Senate Bill 7, for instance, was one of the bills I believe I saw them support. It's if any of you remember Ralph Reed, it's his group. For those who don't remember, he was a recipient of the money that Tom DeLay laundered. He told the team, some of his Abramoff and Scanlon were the last names of the individuals that worked for Tom DeLay. They went out and told the Tigua Indians, we'll help you get your casino reopened if you give us big campaign contributions. And then they turned around and gave it to Ralph Reed to fight an anti-gambling campaign. They're back in Texas about 15 years later, I guess maybe 20 years later at this point, but they're back in Texas and engaging in a bad way on voting rights. And so faith voices are needed to counter that, just the same way that faith voices are needed to counter on religious freedom. But like I said, there's still quite a few days left in session, and there are some things that we are watching and monitoring. We don't have specific bills for you to take action on yet. But we are talking about this issue because we may still need to mobilize in the next 2 weeks.
We might revisit some of this in the action alert section. Excuse me. But I hope I'm throwing a softball to you here. It seems like on a lot of these issues where the religious right has organized, that it's especially important for our membership to engage and mobilize. Is that true?
Absolutely? Yeah, it's absolutely critical. There was public opinion polling. It was in the publication, the 19th.
Yeah.
And they were citing the Public Religion Research Institute's academic polling. There's polling for politics that's about 800 people sample size. Then there's what the Public Religion Research Institute does, which is academic. It's on the thousands or tens of thousands of scale of people that they poll. So it's much more accurate and reliable. Yeah. And what it says quite clearly is that a majority of people of faith support LGBTQ equality. But that is not the national narrative. The national narrative is that it's faith versus the LGBTQ community. And nothing is going to change that until y'all get loud. And it's going to be uncomfortable. We've been through 20, 30 years of fighting of this inside our churches. But it is critical at this time to get loud, to show, to witness, frankly, witness to people who have been marginalized and discriminated against, that is not the way of our faiths. Whatever your faith might be, it is time to get very loud, to bear witness to what you really believe, and to take back the mantle that's been stolen from you, from a well-organized and small but vocal minority.
So, Josh, we're going to come back to you during the action alert section, but the homework, I assume, for this section is read Equal Liberty and keep.
Here, hold up publication here.
Yeah, sure. If you go online and Google Texas Impact, Equal Liberty,
there you go.
This little document, large document, but this document will
award-winning document.
Award-winning, that's true. We did get it. Yeah, will appear. Google Texas Impact, Equal Liberty. It still pops up. I checked it just a little while ago. It's the first thing that pops up. It is the foundational document that will remind you about the thing that you fought for so many years ago and continue to fight for to this day. And it's time for us to continue to re-engage on the issue of religious liberty for everybody, and to really make sure that Christian nationalism does not take hold in this pluralistic, religiously diverse, beautiful nation.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh. And we are excited to, that voice you heard in the background was our executive director, Bee Moorhead, who we're excited to have with us today. If for no other reason than Josh doesn't have to do 3 consecutive segments. But Josh, we'll come back to you in a minute. Bee, thanks for joining us. How are you feeling?
I am feeling heartened and happy to be here, Scott, and I'm always excited to see your smiling face.
I'm not allowed to ask Josh how he feels, so I'm glad I could do that with you today.
Yeah, well, no, it's best for everyone if you're not.
So let's excuse me. So Bee, we have talked a lot over the course of the last few weeks in our action alerts and on this program about the many bad voting bills, the voter suppression bills that the Texas legislature is considering. And I think it's fair to say that the two highest profile are Senate Bill 7 and House Bill 6. This is a reminder of where we are as of recording today at noon on April 12th. The Senate has passed Senate Bill 7 and is waiting for a hearing in the House. And the House, just this last week, the House Elections Committee passed House Bill 6. So it's sitting in the Calendars Committee waiting to be scheduled for a vote in the House. Did I get all that right?
Yes, so far so good.
That's good. So last week or 2 weeks ago, the business community really started mobilizing, and you saw a lot of press about how the business community in Texas was coming out opposing these efforts to suppress Texans' votes. Last week, it was the faith community's turn. And so obviously we hosted a press conference in partnership with Dallas Black Clergy, Friendship West Baptist Church, and Faith Commons, as well as other faith leaders. How would you describe the movement we've seen in the last week of Texas faith leaders coming together to oppose these efforts to suppress votes?
Well, I mean, I think it is heartening, I guess is one way to say it. I'll start by saying Josh and I just came from a press conference with civil rights leaders and faith leaders at the Capitol. It was sponsored by the NAACP and LULAC, and League of Women Voters was there. Texas Impact was there. It's important that all of us kind of come together around the issue. It's not, I guess I want to say, voter suppression is an equal opportunity oppressor. I mean, there is something in it for every community to fear. One of the concerns I think that Texas Impact has is that even people who think of themselves as generally privileged, people who don't go through their daily life worrying about being marginalized or targeted in any way, are targeted in these bills. Their chance to vote by mail is diminished. The likelihood that they're going to be confronted by, an aggressive person with a video camera who wants to follow them around as they're casting their vote, that is likely in the bills that we're seeing. So it's not an issue that just impacts a few vulnerable people. Having said that, it's very clear it's targeting vulnerable people, and it's targeting people who have struggled for a long time to make their voices heard. And it's hard not to think that as the country has gone through the past episode of rethinking racism, the white community trying to get its head around the idea of systemic racism, that these bills show up at a particularly potent moment when there is real racial tension in the country. So I think what I would say to our members, and I guess I'm just going to take executive director privilege and say, this is what I want to say to the membership of Texas Impact. Your stories of your life in your community are what legislators need to hear from you. And I know that we say it and we model it, and it's really hard to do it in the moment. You kind of got to sit and think for a minute while you're making dinner or while you're folding clothes or while you're driving to the store, whatever it is. Chew on the idea that your unique story is what your legislator needs to hear, not your regurgitation of facts that you've gotten, even if they're really great facts from Texas Impact. We want you to know the information about the legislation, but you as a person who lives in a specific house in a specific neighborhood, who shops at a specific store, whose kids go to a specific school, who worships at a specific congregation, who belongs to a specific Rotary Club, or golfs at a particular golf course, or any of those particularities give you mass and weight with that legislator so that they can understand that you're a real constituent, not a figment of the imagination of a statewide grassroots organization. It is really hard to overstate how important that corporeal nature of constituents is, particularly when we're still dealing with COVID. We're going to be dealing with COVID. It's still challenging for people to get together. When they do, it's a little bit, sorry, to contaminate your mask here, but we're seeing each other all looking like the Lone Ranger, aren't we? It's a little hard to develop a relationship in that context. So we've set up a page on our website with a unique URL, everyvotetx.org. On that website are 3 concrete actions. 1, sign the statement, say it's a petition saying we don't like these bills. You agree with all the other thousands of people that you don't like these bills. 2, you can click to send an email to your legislator. We are partnering with the League of Women Voters on that. So you're going to be directed to leagues. Super easy, click here action. And 3, we want you to call your legislator. And of course, you Weekly Witness aficionados know that we have a list of all the 800 numbers that they need to call. But when you do all those things, bear in mind, what's important is you, a particular Texas voter, and why you, as a person of faith and conscience, a Texan, a voter, and a constituent, want to help that legislator do the right thing and say no to this legislation.
Well, you got to my next question. What should they do next? Just as a reminder, everyvotetx.org. Everybody who's listening should be going to that website right now and sharing it with your networks so that they join the movement. One last question for you, Bee, before we turn it back over to Josh. That press conference last week it was inspiring to me, even as a staff person, right? I felt like I went to church. I think I tweeted it. Why is it particularly important that Texas faith leaders speak out like that at this moment?
Texas faith leaders, like faith leaders across the country, need to remind themselves and the rest of us that the faith community has been working for voting rights since day one, since the First Amendment was written and before it was even thought of. Faith leaders were at the forefront of believing that every person's vote matters. Why? Because God made every person and every person is equally loved. So every voice is important. Every vote is somebody's voice. So faith leaders have a unique responsibility to bring that message that it's not. Is it important because if businesses don't like our policies, they won't do business in Texas? You bet. And if they don't, then that'll be a problem for us. Is it important because it will have conflict and our communities will be less safe if we can't all get together on things? Yeah, that's true too. But the most important bedrock reason that voting rights are so important to American democracy is that they affirm a universally held, universally shared belief among all our faith traditions that every human person is of equal worth to God. That's what it's about. That's what voting, that's what the American promise of voting says to people all over the world, is that the United States affirms that regardless of how you conceive of God, we all agree God loves you, God loves me, and God loves that guy who's going to cancel out your vote just the same way.
All right, so we got 2 weekly words today. Thanks, Bee, for that. And I'll just remind everyone, everyvotetx.org. In addition to doing the 3 things on there, signing the statement, sending the email, making the telephone call, also remember to use social media, tag your legislators, use hashtag TXLEGE, TXLEG, and Texas Faith Votes. So we can see all of you who are doing that work. I'm going to go check my Twitter account as soon as we get done here to make sure you're doing that. So we'll look forward to seeing you online.
Can I say one last thing, Scott?
Absolutely.
Hashtag SB7, hashtag HB6, and bonus points for tagging any of our partner organizations at League of Women Voters, at LVWTX, tag the Civil Rights Project, tag NAACP. They're doing hard work. Tag LULAC, because the more that you do that, Texas Impact family, the more that you tag our friends, the more that you say, hey, I'm with you on this, the more that they'll be able to amplify that the faith community is here too. So we're all doing it together. But now I'm going to leave Josh alone.
All right, Bee, thanks for the time. Thanks for joining us. All right, Josh, did we miss anything on that voting section, or the homework clear?
Oh, I thought it was pretty clear. Again, our segment on religious liberty moved into a discussion of voting rights, and that's not a rabbit trail. That's by design. I mean, what's fundamentally at issue here is there are some folks who still think in 2021 that we're the real America, and those folks aren't, and that's what's driving both the discriminatory bills that masquerade as religious liberty, and that's also what's driving the move in voting rights to disenfranchise some of those other folks that aren't real Americans. And we have to stand up and get loud and say no, that equal protection. We're all children of God. Period.
All right, appreciate that. So let's move on to the action alert for this week. Again, as a reminder, you'll be able to find that this afternoon at texasimpact.org in the Action Center. And Josh, the lead the last couple of weeks on that has been voting, and we encourage y'all to keep doing all of the things we've been saying on voting, but turning our focus this week to a couple different issues: hunger, payday lending, and bullying of LGBTQ children and families. Let's start out with these food bills at the top that are being heard in the House Human Services Committee. I always like it when there are things we can support. So I'm going to walk through some of those.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I was telling a lobbyist friend, our support to oppose ratio is way off this session. And he was reassuring us that was quite okay. So again, the action alert, we're going to, let me just kind of walk through it. Bills that combat hunger. There are a number of them. I won't spend a whole lot of time going through the nitty-gritty details of them all. The bottom line is that we are for bills that reduce hunger, and we're against bills that increase hunger. That's not a hard position, right? I mean,
pretty simple, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit like the old Arnold Schwarzenegger talking point when he ran for governor. I'm for things that help families. I'm against things that hurt families. Like, that's essentially how simple this is. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bills that all do things to expand SNAP, which is the I can't remember the acronym at this particular moment, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. There we go. All bills that make it easier for different communities to participate to fight hunger. And then we have one bill that would be a drug testing bill for TANF that we oppose. And so it's all one big call. It's actually several calls, but it's all calls to one big committee, the House Human Services Committee. So often what happens is they'll have a day. There'll be a death penalty day. There'll be, in this case, this is SNAP day for this particular committee, where a lot of bills that are all on a similar subject matter are at the same time, so that all the stakeholders can come together and the committee can work on that policy at one time. That's what's clearly happening in this committee. And so go ahead and call that committee, support these bills, oppose that one, and let them know that these bills are important.
All right. So next up on the list will be payday lending bills, or bill, I guess. What do we have there?
Yeah, so there are quite a few, and this is, well, frankly, this is what's holding up the action alert a little bit. We're checking with coalition partners because there are a number of them. The Pensions, Investments, and Financial Services Committee is having Payday Lending Day. And so these are relatively more complicated bills than do you want somebody to have a meal to eat. They get more into a financial product. The regulatory nature is a little more complicated. So we are still vetting these bills to make sure that we support good ones and oppose bad ones. And we're still looking at that. That's what's holding it up. So stay tuned for that list. When we go public with the action alert, there will be a list in there that will make it. For those who may not know or may not be familiar with the issue of payday lending, so there are roughly 3 in 5 Texans that go to a bank. And that leaves roughly 2 in 5 Texans that are called unbanked or underbanked, or they don't use traditional financial market products. For a number, these are often poor people who, for whatever reason, don't use banks. They often use alternative financial services. And one of the most predatory ones is payday lending, where you go in and you need it. So something terrible has happened. Your car broke down. Your kid had to go to the doctor, and you got to pay that bill. So you go in with, and you basically say, my next paycheck is my collateral. And it is a very high interest with huge user fees. In fact, the fees really are where they make their money, because if you can't pay it back the next cycle, then you pay another fee to extend your loan. And then you pay another fee 2 weeks later to extend your loan. And you pay another fee 2 weeks later to extend your loan. And you're caught in this cycle of debt. Another one is auto title lending, where you basically sign over your car. And of course, people get in trouble with these loans and their family car gets taken. So all of these bills are going to be aimed at trying to make this a more consumer friendly product and a less predatory product.
All right, so next on the list, and you mentioned this a little bit in the segment at the beginning, that there are 3 bills that you describe in the action alert as bills that bully LGBTQ children. So you want to walk us through those?
I don't know how else to say it. I mean, we did Senate Bill 29. What was that? 2 or 3 weeks ago. That was the one that had to do with kids playing sports and forcing people to play sports with their biological gender in high school. Kind of thought that might be the end of it this session. I don't know why we thought that. So that bill's terrible. It marginalizes children. These bills this week are even worse. There's 2 of them that are, I don't think they're companions, but they're super close. So you got Senate Bill 1311 that they're probably hearing right now or later today in Senate State Affairs. And then you have the House version of it, 1399, that will be on Wednesday. These bills are basically telling doctors you're not permitted to perform certain medical procedures, such as the drugs that you might take, or various therapies that are designed for children who identify as trans and are in gender reassignment, some phase of that process. And of course, it's critical to do this in your teenage years to block. I mean, puberty sets things in motion that can't be undone. Let's just be honest about that. So these bills are aimed at regulating doctors, prohibiting doctors from doing it, making sure doctors can't get professional liability insurance. It's all sorts of regulatory measures to prevent doctors from practicing medicine in this area. And then you have one that gets even worse, Senate Bill 1646 by Senator Perry, who also is carrying Senate Bill 29, the sports bill. This one's draconian. I don't have other words for it. It would empower the state it would define any medical therapy for trans children and make it criminal and define it as child abuse, and then allow the state to take the child away from a parent that affirms the child's choices. Um, that is what it is. It's a criminalization bill. And it's kind of interesting, Scott. The bill actually acknowledges the existence of intersex children, which of course we've known about. I mean, the term hermaphrodite is from the Greek. We've known about it for thousands and thousands of years, right? It acknowledges that more than two sexes, biological sexes, exist, which is a startling admission in our opinion. Because there's only two possible conclusions when you acknowledge that scientific fact. It's that either one, God makes mistakes, or two, God designed more than two biological sexes. We strongly would state God doesn't make mistakes, which means God designed more than two biological sexes. We know this because of the existence of intersex children. If God designed more than two biological sexes, then why didn't God design more than two genders? And really, frankly, who is the state of Texas to say? Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox a little bit and say oppose those bills. We're heading down a really bullying and cruel road with that particular bill.
So just as a reminder, later today, we'll have the action alert up, which will have the list of all of these bills and the people who you should be calling about them. And we'd encourage you to activate your networks to make those telephone calls. Josh, those were the priority kind of areas for this week, but you also have some other ones listed. You want to walk through those real quick?
Yeah, let's do. Most of these are positive. Kind of all over. This is where we kind of scatter all over the place. So with renewable, this is a renewable energy bill. Actually, there's two of them. It's a House and the Senate companion. Both are being heard today. Senate Bill 1029 by Senator Huffman and House Bill 3795 by Representative Button. This bill is pretty simple. It would create, it wouldn't allow an appraisal district to raise your appraisal of your house if you choose to put solar on your rooftop or wind generation. They can't come in and say, oh, well, that solar panel is worth X $1,000, so we're going to up your property taxes. It prevents that because that would be a huge disincentive for doing solar if suddenly they could get more taxes out of you. So it's a tax exemption for solar. Senate Bill 1544 by Senator West. We've talked about no-knock warrants a little bit in previous weekly witnesses, but we'll talk about it again. A no-knock warrant, for those who may not be up on what this is, it means the police can come to your house, not announce that they're the police, and just kick down the door. I remember studying this in law school thinking, what a terrible idea, because if you don't know it's the police, for all you know, it's a home invasion. And that's exactly what happened with Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, where the police had the wrong address and the boyfriend thought people were breaking into his house in the middle of the night. And it led to Breonna Taylor being shot by the police and dying. So what this bill would do is create limitations. It doesn't prohibit it outright, but it creates limitations and parameters on the use of these no-knock warrants. And it's important legislation by Senator West, who we had on, I believe it was it a UMW legislative event, talking in depth about some of the criminal justice reforms we'd like to see this session. House Bill 3015, changing subjects completely to Public Information Act request. This is a bill in House State Affairs on Wednesday. So right now, many groups, you may have done it yourself, we do it fairly routinely, will invoke the Public Information Act to request documents from government. Sometimes local governmental or just governmental entities just won't respond to you. And usually a phone call will remind them and get you the information, even though it's been more than 10 days, which is what the law requires. But sometimes they just don't respond at all. And yes, that's illegal. And yes, you could go to court, but going through litigation takes time, a lot of time when you just want the documents and you may need them right away.
We will give him just a second to make it back. Why don't you try one more time from the Hernandez bill?
Okay. Public Information Act. It's an enforcement mechanism to help get those documents quicker without having to go all the way to the courthouse, which is expensive and time consuming. House Bill 2302 by Representative White would create a new criminal offense, but it's specific to police officers. If a police officer makes a false statement in an incident report, that would be a crime. That's obviously related to some of the George Floyd stuff, and it's a good bill. Another support is House Bill 1938 by Representative Jatan. It would create a grant program to help some of the smaller law enforcement agencies have enough data storage for all the body camera video. So it's a good bill that helps with body cameras. And then lastly, we can't end Weekly Witness without talking about a bad voting rights bill. You have House Bill 3920 by Representative Dean. It would basically overturn the Texas Supreme Court's decision from last summer. The Texas Supreme Court said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but basically it's in the hands of the voters to decide whether or not your private medical history makes you qualify under the definition of disabled to vote by mail. What this does is it makes it more convoluted, in our opinion. It creates more ambiguity by excluding, and I quote, a sickness that does not otherwise prevent the voter from leaving the voter's residence. We think that just makes it even more complicated, overturning what the Supreme Court made relatively clear, and is completely unnecessary because not in any way did this lead to any fraud. People just didn't like. I honestly don't know what this is a solution in search of a problem. I'm not sure what they're trying to address with it. So that is the action alert for the week.
All right, appreciate it, Josh. Anything you want to challenge us with before we leave today?
No, I just double down on keep making those calls. And I do want to say one thing. When you make these calls, if you find that the office agrees with you, say thank you and move on. We've got to a very busy point in the session where there is no point in belaboring preaching to the choir. Once you've figured out that you're talking to the choir, thank you, and let them have their time back.
Yeah, we'll note maybe more than any time that we've been doing this for the last couple of sessions, we received quite a bit of feedback from legislative offices last week about the number of telephone calls you all were making. So they're noticing, and we appreciate the effort you all are putting into that. But as Josh said, those can be quick calls, especially if they agree with you.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing that we're hearing that back.
Yep. So let's close out as a reminder for those who would like updates on when we need to make those telephone calls, besides just on the Monday Action Alert. Make sure that you're joining the rapid response team so you can stay updated throughout the course of the week. You can do that in the TexasImpact.org Action Center. We'd also encourage you to consider joining a legislative engagement group to be connected with other advocates in your district to build a relationship with the legislative office. And if you have any questions about any of that, feel free to reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. Or if you just, I had a couple questions in the chat today about bills and various other things. If there are ways that we can support your work, please feel free to reach out. And remember that if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members. You can do that by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, Josh mentioned at the beginning, we're in the busiest 2 or 3 weeks of the legislative session. And so now more than ever, we hope that you and your congregation are active and engaged, that you're sharing this content with your networks, and that you are subscribing to Texas Impact Weekly Witness in the YouTube channel to make sure you're not missing any content. Friends, now is the time. So let's get to work.